Kyoto 1581. The streets are packed. Shoulder to shoulder, thousands of people have stopped whatever they were doing and come outside. Not because of a battle, not because of a fire, because of a man. He stands at the center of it all, and nobody can explain what they're seeing. He is taller than anyone in the crowd, broader. His skin is a shade of black that nobody in the city has ever seen up close, and the crowd doesn't know what to do with that. Some people push forward just to get a better look. Others pull their children back. Rumors move faster than fire, that he's a demon wearing human form, that his skin has been painted, that something is deeply wrong with the world if a man like this is allowed to walk the streets of Kyoto. The chaos follows him everywhere. But somewhere in that crowd, away from the panic, away from the whispers, one man is watching with a completely different expression. Oda Nobunaga isn't afraid. He isn't confused. He is thinking. Nobunaga is already the most dangerous man in Japan. He has shattered armies that outnumbered his. He has burned temples, broken alliances, and made enemies out of people who thought they were untouchable. He sees the world differently than everyone around him, not as it is, but as it could be made. And right now, watching this African stranger survive the full weight of an entire city's fear without flinching, Nobunaga sees something he doesn't see very often. He sees someone worth knowing. What happened next would rewrite Japanese history in ways that nobody saw coming. Not the generals, not the priests, not even the man at the center of the crowd. Because the story of Yasuke wasn't just about a warrior who ended up in the wrong place at the wrong time. It was about what happens when one outsider meets another, and together they build something the world has never seen before. Nobody knows exactly where Yasuke came from. That's not a dramatic exaggeration. That is the historical truth. Historians have argued about it for decades. Some believe he was Mozambican. Others point to Ethiopia, Sudan, or regions deeper into Central Africa. The records from that era are incomplete, filtered through Portuguese translation and Jesuit documentation, shaped by men who were more interested in the mission than the man. What they left behind tells us very little about who Yasuke actually was before Japan. What we do know is this: he arrived on the ship of Alessandro Valignano, an Italian Jesuit priest and visitor of the missions in Asia. Valignano was not a minor figure. He was one of the most important architects of the Jesuit presence in East Asia, a strategist who understood that converting Japan would require more than scripture. It would require respect, relationship, and patience. He was also a man who recognized unusual talent when he saw it. Yasuke was part of his mission. Whether he came as a servant, a bodyguard, or something else entirely depends on which historical source you read and how much you trust it. What every source agrees on is that by the time the Valignano mission arrived in Japan, Yasuke had already been through the world. He had crossed oceans. He had survived systems designed to erase men like him. He had watched civilizations from the outside, learning their structures and their languages, adapting without disappearing. He spoke some Portuguese, possibly other languages. He was, by every account, composed. That composure mattered, because Japan in 1581 was not a peaceful country. It hadn't been for over 100 years. The Sengoku period, the era of warring states, had turned the archipelago into a permanent battlefield of shifting alliances, sudden betrayals, and warlords who built empires and lost them within a generation. The Japan that Yasuke stepped into was a country that had been bleeding for longer than most people could remember. For an outsider, it must have been overwhelming. The language barrier alone was enormous. The cultural rules, the hierarchy, the ceremony, the layers of obligation and honor that governed every interaction were unlike anything in the world Yasuke had come from. And on top of all of that, he was immediately visible. There was no blending in. No easing into the background. Every city he entered, people stopped and stared, and the reaction was rarely quiet. In Kyoto, a crowd so large formed around him that it became dangerous. People were injured in the press. The scene came close to turning violent. And through all of it, Yasuke kept walking. That was the first thing Nobunaga heard about him. Not his size. Not his appearance. The fact that he didn't break. Oda Nobunaga did not summon Yasuke immediately. He waited. He gathered information first. This was characteristic of Nobunaga. He was a man who moved fast, but not carelessly. He had survived long enough and climbed high enough to know the difference between instinct and impulse. What he heard about the African stranger only deepened his interest. So he made the meeting happen. When Yasuke arrived before Nobunaga, the warlord did something that surprised everyone in the room. He ordered his attendants to remove Yasuke's robes and rub his skin. He wanted to see for himself whether the color was painted on. This was not cruelty. For Nobunaga, it was empirical. He needed to understand what he was looking at before he could decide how to think about it. When the rubbing produced no change, he stared for a long moment. Then something shifted. Curiosity became fascination, and fascination moved toward something rarer, genuine respect. Nobunaga began asking questions. What kind of man moved through the world the way Yasuke had moved? Where had he been? What had he seen? How had he survived? The conversation lasted longer than anyone expected. Nobunaga was surrounded by men who competed for his favor, men who performed loyalty as a kind of theater. He had grown up in a world where almost everyone around him had something to gain or something to hide. He had learned to read that. He was extraordinarily good at detecting performance. Yasuke, by contrast, had nothing to perform. He was not a rival daimyo trying to protect his domain. He was not a retainer calculating his position. He was simply there, direct, composed, and entirely without the particular anxieties that defined every other relationship in Nobunaga's life. That was, to Nobunaga, almost unprecedented. He began including Yasuke in private meetings, then in military discussions, then closer still. The speed of it alarmed people around Nobunaga, advisors, generals, men who had spent years building access only to watch a foreign stranger skip past every layer of protocol in a matter of weeks. Resentment was already forming. But Nobunaga didn't care about resentment. He never had. What he cared about was what came next, the final campaign, the endgame of a war that had been going on for over a century, the unification of Japan under a single authority. And he had just found something that might help him get there. What he didn't know, what none of them knew yet, was how little time he had left to use it. Feudal Japan ran on hierarchy the way a machine runs on gears. Remove one, and everything locks up. Your family determined your rank. Your rank determined your role. Your role determined how you dressed, how you spoke, where you sat, and how you died. This wasn't custom. It was architecture. The entire social order of Japan had been built on the assumption that these categories were permanent, and that the people inside them stayed where they belonged. Nobunaga broke that assumption constantly. It was practically his defining characteristic. He promoted men from low birth into military command. He dismissed advisors who had served his family for generations. He ignored temple authority, burned monasteries when they moved against him, and laughed at the idea that tradition should dictate strategy. But what he did with Yasuke was different. He didn't just include him. He elevated him. Yasuke received a residence, a personal stipend, and a ceremonial katana, one of the most significant objects a samurai could possess, carrying symbolic weight that went far beyond the physical blade. He was given direct access to Nobunaga's inner circle at a level that most Japanese-born retainers never achieved. He ate with Nobunaga. traveled with him, stood close during war councils, where the fate of entire provinces was decided. Word spread fast. The reaction across Japan was sharp. Among common people, Yasuke had already become something close to legend, a figure so far outside normal experience that stories about him had grown wild and exaggerated by the time they reached the provinces. Some believed he was supernatural. Others thought Nobunaga had captured a foreign demon and was using him as a weapon. Among the military elite, the reaction was colder. Rival daimyos saw it as provocation. Nobunaga had a history of using shock as a political tool, and granting samurai recognition to an African foreigner fit that pattern, a deliberate signal that the old rules meant nothing to him. Some of his own generals found it unsettling, not from cruelty, but from the deep discomfort of watching their world's logic visibly fail. Because the logic said this should not work. The logic said Yasuke should be lost, trapped by language, isolated by appearance, paralyzed by the weight of a culture he had no framework to understand. Instead, he adapted. Not by disappearing into Japanese culture, but by moving through it with the same composure he had brought through every other world he'd crossed. He learned. He observed. He found the edges of things and worked within them without losing whatever it was that had made Nobunaga notice him in the first place. That was the part nobody could quite explain. Other foreigners had come to Japan. Jesuit priests, Portuguese traders, a handful of Dutch merchants moving carefully around the edges of power. None of them had gotten close to what Yasuke had. None of them had been trusted the way he was trusted. And the difference wasn't size or strength or novelty. Those faded quickly in a country used to spectacle. The difference was something harder to name. Something that Nobunaga recognized, and everyone around them could feel but not articulate. Yasuke was, in the deepest sense, unafraid. Not reckless, not aggressive, just genuinely, stably unafraid. In a court built on fear of rivals, fear of losing favor, fear of death arriving in a form you didn't anticipate, that quality was almost alien. It was also, in ways no one fully understood yet, about to be tested. There's a particular kind of fear that moves ahead of an army before it arrives. Nobunaga understood this better than almost any commander of his era. He had built his military reputation not just on tactical brilliance, though he had that, but on the deliberate construction of dread. The massacre at Nagashima, the burning of Mount Hiei. These were not accidents of war. They were messages sent in the language armies understand best. Yasuke became part of that language. Stories about the giant black warrior spread through provinces that hadn't yet faced Nobunaga's forces. The stories mutated as they traveled. By the time they reached distant domains, Yasuke had become something between a man and something else entirely, a figure of monstrous size and power, who could not be killed by ordinary weapons, who had come from a land so far away that it didn't exist on any Japanese map. Enemies who had never seen him were already afraid. This was useful. Nobunaga knew how to use it. But Yasuke's value wasn't only symbolic. In the inner circle, he functioned as something more subtle. He had spent years moving through the world as an outsider, reading environments quickly, navigating between cultures with no margin for error. That instinct, the ability to read a room, detect a shift in loyalty, sense when the surface of something didn't match what was underneath, translated directly into the kind of political intelligence that Nobunaga valued. Japan in the early 1580s was entering what felt like its final chapter of fragmentation. Nobunaga controlled more territory than any warlord since the Ashikaga shogunate had begun its collapse. The campaign to unify Japan was not hypothetical anymore. It was close enough that the men around him were already calculating what a unified Japan would mean for them personally. Who would rise, who would be reduced, whose loyalty would be rewarded, and whose would be quietly set aside. The calculations were happening everywhere, including, though nobody wanted to say it openly, among Nobunaga's own generals. Eiichiro Mitsuhide had served Nobunaga for years. He was intelligent, capable, and deeply proud, the kind of man who remembered every slight and filed it somewhere precise and permanent. Nobunaga had humiliated him publicly on more than one occasion, in the particular way that Nobunaga sometimes treated even his best generals, as though demonstrating that no one was too valuable to be diminished. Mitsuhide had absorbed it, adapted, continued serving. But something was accumulating beneath the surface. Something that hadn't broken yet. Nobody saw it coming. Not even Yasuke. June 21, 1582. Nobunaga is in Kyoto, staying at Hanoji Temple with a small personal guard. The main army is elsewhere, deployed for an ongoing campaign. He is not expecting a threat, not here, not now, not from a general who has served him for over a decade. The night is quiet, the kind of quiet that in history tends to come just before everything breaks. Eiichiro Mitsuhide moves 13,000 soldiers into the city under cover of darkness. Nobody stops him. There is no alarm. By the time anyone understands what is happening, the temple is already surrounded. The attack begins before dawn. Nobunaga's guards are overwhelmed almost immediately, not because they fight poorly, but because the numbers are impossible. The attack isn't a battle. It's an execution with extra steps. Nobunaga fights himself for a time, which says something about the man. When his guards fall, he picks up a spear and enters the courtyard. He is wounded. The situation becomes clear. He retreats into an inner chamber and dies there. Possibly by his own hand, possibly in the fire that consumes the temple. The accounts differ. What they agree on is that by morning, Oda Nobunaga, the man who had come closer to unifying Japan than anyone in a century, is gone. Yasuke is not at Hanoji that night. He is with Nobunaga's son, Oda Nobunaga, at Nijo Castle, a short distance away. When news of the attack reaches them, the situation becomes desperate almost instantly. Nobunaga's forces are also heavily outnumbered. Mitsuhide's army is moving through the city, eliminating every Oda line presence it can find. The window for escape is narrowing by the minute. Yasuke fights. That part is documented. In the chaos of that night, with the Oda clan collapsing around him and a city turning hostile, Yasuke does not run. He stays with Nobunaga in the battle until the battle is no longer survivable. Nobunaga eventually orders him to go. There is nothing more to be done. Yasuke surrenders his sword to Mitsuhide's forces rather than allowing it to be taken by force. This detail matters. Surrendering the sword was a final act of control in a situation that had taken everything else. It was not submission. It was a statement that he had made his choices freely, and he would end this particular chapter of his life on his own terms. Mitsuhide, to his credit, does not execute him. He reportedly states that Yasuke is an animal, not Japanese, therefore not subject to the obligations of warrior honor, not worth the significance that a formal execution would imply. He sends him back to the Jesuit mission. It reads like an insult. It may have saved his life. After that, the records go silent. There is no account of where Yasuke went after the Jesuit mission received him. No document confirming how long he stayed in Japan, whether he left the country, or what happened in the years that followed. The man who had been one of the most recognized figures in the most powerful court in Japan simply disappears from the written record. History does this sometimes. It follows power, and when the power source collapses, everyone connected to it becomes suddenly difficult to trace. Nobunaga's network fractured overnight. The people who had documented life inside that world scattered. Mitsuhide himself was dead within 2 weeks, hunted down and killed by Toyotomi Hideyoshi, who then spent the next decade consolidating everything Nobunaga had built. In the chaos of all that transition, a foreign warrior with no surviving patron and no institutional record to follow him simply vanished. But the story didn't. It lived in fragments, in Jesuit letters sent back to Europe, in a Japanese children's book published centuries later, in folktales that moved through provinces and changed shape with every generation that retold them. Yasuke became, in the popular imagination, slightly larger than he already was, which was already extraordinary. He became a symbol that different eras could load with different meaning. Proof of Japan's openness. Proof of a single warlord's radical vision. Proof that history contains more than the official version wants to include. In the 20th and 21st centuries, the interest intensified. Historians began taking his story seriously, in ways that earlier scholarship had not. His image appeared in manga, in video games and novels, in films and animated series. Each version interpreted him differently, because the gaps in the record are wide enough to carry almost any interpretation. But underneath every version, the core stays the same. A man arrived in Japan from a world no one there had ever seen. He crossed every barrier that should have stopped him: language, culture, appearance, status, the entire rigid architecture of a society built to keep people in their assigned place. He earned the trust of the most powerful and most suspicious man in the country. He fought beside him. He stayed loyal when loyalty had stopped making strategic sense. And when it was over, when the world he had helped build was burning, he faced the end of it without breaking. That is, when you strip everything else away, the actual story. Not the samurai status. Not the legend. Not the centuries of retelling. Just a man in an impossible position, doing what he believed was right. To the very last moment, anyone recorded him doing anything at all. The rest is silence. And sometimes, silence is the loudest thing history leaves us.